I know how much time you put in with the Russian president to make this call happen. It's not the first time you've spoken to him. It's not the first time the President of the United States has spoken to the Russian leader either. Could you set the stage for us, sir? How different was this call?
I thought the call was epic, Jonathan. I thought it was epic, transformational. Those are the sorts of adjectives that I use about this call. The president and President Trump and President Putin were in sync with one another. The call was outcome-oriented. They were talking about how to save lives, how to stop the carnage, and for me, I was proud to be an American sitting there listening to it.
Steve, let's talk about some of the outcomes. We're hopeful that ultimately we end up with a 30-day ceasefire. Before we get there, we're working towards things like a prisoner swap. We're working towards a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea. That's important too. There was also a conversation yesterday about maybe an agreement to limit attacks on energy infrastructure. And we'd love to build on that, because earlier on this morning we heard from the Ukrainian leader who said that overnight Russia sent 150 drones and hit Ukrainian energy. I just wonder what was actually agreed and whether Russia crossed the line overnight.
Well, what was agreed between the two presidents was, and it was at President Trump's suggestion, that there be a cessation of attacks on energy infrastructure from both sides and civilian infrastructure for that matter. Also, working towards a Black Sea moratorium on hits on naval vessels and freighters carrying grain and things of that sort, and ultimately that would evolve into a full-on ceasefire, which is a bit more complicated because there's a 2,000-kilometer border, there's Kursk, and there's a lot of details that go into that. But with regard to your question on some of the reporting with regard to the Russian drones last night, I have it on good information from a telephone call I had before I went on this show that President Putin issued an order within 10 minutes of his call with the president directing Russian forces not to be attacking any Ukrainian energy infrastructure. And any attacks that happened last night would have happened before that order was given. In fact, the Russians tell me this morning that 7 of their drones were on their way when President Putin issued his order, and they were shot down by Russian forces. So I tend to believe that President Putin is operating in good faith. He said that he was going to be operating in good faith to the president yesterday, and I take him at his word.
So, Mr. Witkoff, is your understanding that as of today, energy facilities, energy infrastructure will be off limits?
That's my understanding, yes, ma'am.
Do you think the next stage potentially, as we get the roadmap towards 30-day full ceasefire, potentially geography should be off limits, like drones hitting Kyiv?
You know, I can't speak to that. I think the idea behind a 30-day ceasefire, first of all, we made more progress yesterday than has been made in the last 3.5 years. The two leaders actually talked and committed to cessation of attacks on energy infrastructure and civilian infrastructure. They talked about reviving the Black Sea maritime agreement that had been negotiated several years ago and never really implemented. Those are monumental things, and they're trust-building things as well. And I think beyond that, they also went into how you would put the finishing touches on a full-on ceasefire. That full-on ceasefire has a lot to do with this 2,000-kilometer line that where the Ukrainians are lined up against the Russians. It's complicated. There are different battlefield conditions in various spots. That's for the technical teams to figure it out. And they're going to be meeting in Saudi Arabia, I believe, beginning Monday and Tuesday. So lots of progress happened yesterday, and it happened in large part because of President Trump.
Let's talk about that meeting in Saudi Arabia in the next week or so. The team's going to be led by, I believe, Secretary Rubio. I think we all want to know what needs to happen at that meeting before the two leaders end up in the same room to get to that end deal that we all want to see. What needs to happen in the next week?
Well, I'm not sure that the Secretary of State has done an amazing job, as has the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz. They were both at the last meeting in Jeddah. It went well. Lots of trust building happened. And I believe on Monday we actually have the technical teams going. And why? Because that's what we're down to. We don't need to have the larger overarching discussions. That's been had, and it was completed yesterday between the two leaders. They agreed on a pathway to some ceasefire conditions today and to a full-on ceasefire that will be negotiated over the coming days. I actually think in a couple of weeks we're going to get to it. So lots of good things. Now it's for the technical teams to dot the I's and cross the T's, and everybody is committed to that process.
If you think we're going to get there in a couple of weeks, could we then see a meeting in person between President Trump and President Putin in the kingdom?
You know, I can't speak for them, but my best bet would be that it's likely to happen. They have a great rapport together. They had a great rapport in the first Trump administration. It was on display yesterday. This was really a very positive, very proactive, outcome-oriented call, and that's who President Trump is. He's there to get to the goal line, and we went a long way yesterday to doing that.
You've known the president a long, long time, going back decades. In fact, there's very few people that know him better than you do. There's a lot of people speculating about what the motives are, what the end objectives are. If we could just sit on that for a moment. Does the push for peace in Ukraine run parallel with a push to normalize US-Russia relations? Or, Steve, are they separate issues?
No, I don't think there's any doubt that the two are important. Russia is a critical relationship for us. It's critical as it affects all other things out there. China, Iran, the Middle East. These two leaders coming together and having conversations about nuclear proliferation, which they did yesterday and was enormously positive. This is enormously beneficial for the world at large. And the president believes in this. He believes in peace. He believes in engaging. He believes in using peace through strength to create a better world for everybody. And with that could come a drop in defense budgets. Take all that money and spend it on things that matter more than waging war all the time. This is his policy. And so he's to be commended for that. Yesterday was literally transformational as far as I am concerned.
Mr. Witkoff, so then is the idea of its normalization to draw a wedge between Russia and China and Russia and Iran as well, to further isolate America's adversaries like Tehran and Beijing?
I think normalization is about having real conversation. President Biden, according to President Putin, did not speak to President Putin for 3.5 years. That's not a proper way to run policy. President Trump, in a short 8 weeks, has spoken to President Putin twice. Very, very positive and constructive conversations. He's directed me on his behalf to go to Moscow. I've had close to 8 hours of conversations with President Putin and met with other key people on his team. And he's directed the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, the CIA Director, Pete Hegseth, our Secretary of Defense. Everybody is engaged in this process, and it's really wonderful to see. I think the people ought to be uplifted, and I think you're going to see some very, very positive results in the near term.
In the lengthy conversations you have had with the Russian leader, did restrictions on Russian energy come up at all? Did they come up yesterday?
When you say restrictions, Jonathan, on Russian energy, what do you? I'm not sure what you're asking.
Restrictions on financial services, engaging in deals that restrict the flow of Russian energy, the price cap that the Biden administration pushed over the last year or so, sir. A variety of restrictions that make it difficult for Russian energy to compete with energy elsewhere.
We did not discuss, or the president did not discuss specifically sanctions yesterday, if that's what you're referring to. I think obviously that's a conversation that the two leaders are going to have, and everybody's open to it. But first and foremost, we want a solution that means an end to the fighting. We want to get to the ceasefire. That's the president's policy, and we're going to get to the ceasefire. And I think after that, everything else will be a detail. Sanction relief, and all the other things that go with a full-on peace treaty.
Trump said last night to Fox News that Russia would like to use some of the U.S. economic power. This is an individual who's been against the likes of Nord Stream 2 for years, Mr. Witkoff. You know that. But could you see a world when Russian energy comes back online via pipelines like Nord Stream?
Well, I can certainly see that world, but let me give you an example about the deleterious effects here and why we have to get to a solution. Russian oil today is being sold cheap to China. I'm not sure that's such a wonderful benefit of
India.
Okay, you're underscoring my point. So there are all these deleterious things that could come from this, and I think the beginning of it is a conversation. I think it's sort of unacceptable for two world leaders of the stature of a Russian president and an American president who haven't talked in 3.5 years. That's an unacceptable policy program for the president. He wants to get things done, and you get things done by getting on a telephone or meeting personally and instructing your staffs to do that, which is what he's done here.
Mr. Witkoff, it's a conversation we've had a lot on this program, which is the fact that sanctions, when it comes to Russia, didn't change Putin's motives, and they still were able to fund the war by selling a lot of this energy. It just created new markets for Russia to be willing to trade. Scott Bessent, though, the Treasury Secretary, said the other day that we will go to a 10 and bring sanctions if we have to on Russia to bring Putin to the table. Do you see President Trump getting to that point, lifting sanctions to a 10 in order to cajole Putin to the table for this ceasefire?
Look, Scott Bessent is a great Treasury Secretary. I'm not going to speak to what he had to say. I'm going to say this. I've had 2 meetings at the direction of President Trump with President Putin in the last several weeks that have collectively aggregated to almost 8 hours. Many other people, senior people in the administration, are having meetings with their colleagues and their counterparts there. The president has directed all of this. There is amazing progress being made. Yesterday, in one telephone call, we talked about an immediate ceasefire on energy infrastructure. That's game-changing. And also the Black Sea moratorium, game-changing. And the contours of how we get to a personal ceasefire, a 30-day ceasefire, game-changing. Enormous progress as compared to where we were, because we're communicating, we're talking in a collegial, constructive manner, and everybody is outcome-oriented, the outcome being the end of fighting there and the end of the killing there.
We'd all like to see that, sir. If we could just finish on Europe, something we've not discussed in the last 10 minutes or so. The Europeans, Germany and the EU are pushing to rearm. They're set to spend hundreds of billions of euros on defence. That's something that President Trump has been pushing for quite a while. Does he welcome that? Does it complicate talks in any way? Does it antagonise Russia and make this harder? How does he view that at the moment?
Look, I think the president has a policy which is that Europe should pay more for their own defense. And so I think to the extent that that's what's happening, I think that's a good thing. Rearming and all the other stuff that leads to more conflagration, that leads to, that undermines a peace process, I would say that that's not such a good thing. So look, we're here to get a deal in Russia and Ukraine, and we're well on the way to getting it done. And I think you're going to hear some really positive things happening as these talks continue.
Mr. Witkoff, you're a successful businessman that is now really at the height of diplomacy around the world. European strong economic ties with Russia did not prevent Putin for his full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2021. Do you think it could prevent hostilities in the future if we were to see a ceasefire and businesses and trade were back to come into the fore?
I don't think there's any doubt. I think the point is to get everybody focused not on war, but on making their countries better, on spending the money on their people. In Ukraine, on rebuilding, on doing good things for their people. That's how you get to a better place, and that's President Trump's agenda throughout the world. And we see it being his agenda is very effective. People buy into it. I was on the phone with President Macron last night, giving him a download of what happened. And we had a really positive conversation about the outcome. So I think there's a lot of buy-in to President Trump's leadership, the way he's leading the world today, not just the United States. It's just exceptional for me to watch.
We've only got a few seconds left with you, sir, but I think that's an important comment to make. Relations with Europe, they are endorsing, are they, this approach that the president is taking? Because publicly they seem to be saying one thing. Are they endorsing this approach privately?
I'm hearing a lot of endorsement, Jonathan.
That's a very interesting development, sir. I wanted to finish on you personally, just for a moment if we can. For the people internationally that aren't aware, sir, you were widely regarded as a talented negotiator, making a fortune in real estate before taking on these responsibilities. And you seem to be having an instant impact in the role, and it started in January before Trump even got into the White House with the agreement, the ceasefire and hostage exchange between Israel and Hamas in January. Can we just finish on how transferable those skills actually are? How different is this for you to go from that world of real estate to this, life and death in Ukraine?
Well, you know, I went into the real estate business. I was a young lawyer, and I went in because I wanted to be Donald Trump, to tell you the truth. And that really is the truth, by the way. I've talked about this in the past. He was a great real estate guy, and to a large extent, I follow his example when it comes to negotiating. The president is all about clearing up misconceptions, clearing up miscommunication, figuring out how to get a good deal for all stakeholders, all constituents as a part of the deal, and then deciding beforehand what the outcome he wants is. That's how deals get structured, and they're not all that dissimilar in the political realm. And that's how we've done it in the Middle East. We follow his direction in that way, and it's highly effective.